In this tutorial, we'll look at the various modelling techniques that will be used to create the Trout model you can see on the screen. We'll look at the required vectors that will be used to create the underlying fish shape and the methods for adding the detail to give a truly realistic look. And we're going to start now by first closing this part. So we'll start now by creating a new file, and we'll be working with a single-sided job with a width of 12 inches, a height of 4 inches and a thickness of 3/4 of an inch. We'll be zeroing from the material surface, and the XY dating position will be in the lower left hand corner. Our modelling resolution in this case will set to high, and we can click OK to accept those settings, and you'll see the workspace placed on the centre of the screen. And we now need to think about building the Trout shape. And a good place for us to start would be by bringing in the bitmap image, and then we can think about placing the shapes on top. So with that, I'm going to come up to Import Bitmap under File Operations, and we're going to be using this Rainbow Trout JPEG. So we'll click Open, and you'll see that then placed centrally on the workspace. Now we can clearly see that the fish is not big enough for the size of our workspace, so the first thing that we need to do is just size that up. So under Transform Objects, we'll come over to Set Selected Object Size. We've got the image selected, and we're going to keep Link X and Y selected because I'm going to alter the height and we want the width to proportionally increase too. So I'm going to go ahead now and increase that to 4 inches and click Apply, and you can see that that's now been enlarged and it's placed centrally on the workspace. Now at this point we need to be considering the vectors that we're going to need to create to form the underlying shape. So we would need to make one for the body, some for the fins, and maybe some for around the face and the eye, and piecing that together at first manually and then smoothing to create the necessary shape. But given the time constraints of this tutorial, I'm going to actually bring in the pre-created vectors for this. So we'll go up to File Operations. I'm going to select the file import, and we're going to be bringing in this EPS file. Now that could be DXF, DWG, etc. But in this case it's an EPS, so we'll click Open. And we can now see those vectors highlighted over the top of the underlying image. And those represent the shapes that we're going to use to create all of the different features such as the body, fins, eyes and face. Note for instance that if we look at vectors such as this fin, that it actually passes into the main body shape because we'll be creating this as a separate component and we want to merge this into the main body, so therefore we've got an overlap of these two regions. Okay, so the next step for me is to start thinking about the layers because we want to add in some control in terms of both the layers and the levels in the component tree. So here we're going to come up and start taking a look at how we're going to organise our vectors. So we'll go into our layers drop down and you'll see that we've got 3 layers. We've got the bitmap layer, which was created when we imported the original bitmap image. We have the original layer 1, which was created when we started a new part. And we have the new import layer onto which these vectors have been placed. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just rename this layer. So we'll right click and rename, and we're going to call this outline. And the next thing that I want to do is just take a selection of these vectors and place them on layer 1 and rename that. So I'm just going to take the 2 vectors that we're going to use as the drive rails for the 2-rail sweep. So I'll shift and pick those 2. And then I'm just going to also select the 2 cross sections. And with those all selected, we're going to right click and we're going to move those to layer 1. And I'm just going to come back up to the layers menu and we're going to rename layer 1 and we'll call that basic shape. So this is going to be the underlying basic shape, and we'll have moved these vectors that we selected onto that layer. So just to check that now, we can switch the visibility of the bitmap layer off. And we've got the basic shape, so we can switch that off and then back on. And we've also got our outline. Okay, so those are the different forms, and we're going to start by taking a look at the basic shape. So with this, we can focus in on just these vectors that we have here. So we've got the 2 sort of main contours, which represent the drive rails for our 2-rail sweep. And we've got the 2 cross sections. And to get started with this, I'm just going to select the first drive rail. And I'm going to hold down Shift and select the second, and then I'm going to come over and go into the Modelling tab. And from here, under Modelling Tools on the first row, second in, we can see Create a Shape by sweeping between 2 rail vectors. So that's the 2-rail sweep tool. I've already got my rail selected, so we can go straight to use selection. And we can see by these small arrows along the rails that they're both going in the same direction. So that's good. But if you did find that you wanted to reverse those, you can do so by hovering the cursor over one of the rails, right clicking, and using the first option to reverse rail. But we don't need to do that in this case. So moving on down the form, I'm going to choose to scale cross sections with width. And this means that where there's a greater distance between the two drive rails, you'll get more height in the shape. And where there's less of a distance between the two, you'll get less height. So in other words, it will vary the height of the shape in accordance with the width of the drive rails. And this means it will give us a more organic fish-like shape as opposed to just keeping the heights consistent throughout. I'm going to choose to sweep between the spans, and I'm not going to choose to scale to exact height here, so we'll just see what's created naturally, and then we can always amend the height at a later point. And in the last section of this form, we can choose our combine mode and also give this component a name. So we're going to be choosing to set the combine mode to add in this case, and we'll just give that a name. So we can call that basic shape. But you'll see that at the moment, apply is grayed out, and that's because before we create our two rail sweep, we need to choose a cross section to use as this profile shape. So we'll shift and select this profile here, and then we'll click apply. And now we can see the component that we've created using the two rail sweep represented in the 2D view. And we can take a look at both the 2D and the 3D view side by side by coming up to the view toolbar and using this option to arrange views horizontally. So now we can see the 2D view at the top of the screen and the 3D view at the bottom. So if we just rotate the 3D view now, we can take a look at the shape that we've created. So we can see now in the wider part of the fish outline, we've got a higher shape, and then where it narrows, we get lower shape height. But at the moment, I don't really like the consistency of the profile throughout the shape. So we've got the curved main body, but you can see in areas like the tail where it should really flatten out to give us a more natural fish shape. And to do that, we've actually got this extra cross section which we can include into the surface. So as we're still in the two rail sweep tool, I'm just going to select that cross section now, and I'm just going to come across to the end of the shape, to the tail section, and I'm just going to left click on this point here on the end point to add that cross section into the end of the shape. So what that's essentially going to do is progressively change from the front end with this profile, and as we come along following the directions of the drive rails, it's going to change progressively into this flatter shape, so it will flatten out at the ends. So if I go ahead and click apply now, we'll see the effect in both the 2D and the 3D view. But if we just take a look at this here, so we'll see that it's definitely flattened the shape out, but it's not really what we require here. So really we need to add in a little bit more control, because what we really want is the rounded shape profile at the front, and then keep it the same through to about 3/4 of the way down the fish, then to transition in this area to this flatter shape and to continue flat until the end. So what we can do to do that is reselect the original profile, and we'll just link that to the first point just to make sure that we've got that profile selected for the front of the shape. We're going to transition that through and keep it rounded up until about this point here. So we'll add in another cross section using that profile, as that's still selected. We're then going to pick up the second cross section, the flatter profile, and we're going to have that transition from the rounded down through here, so it's flattening off. So we'll pick that up at about the middle of the transition from body to tail, so we'll put that there. And then we'll keep it consistent with that profile all the way till the end, so we can see that we've already placed that profile at the end there. Okay, so what we should now see is a consistent rounded profile from the front up until this point, and then transitioning from the first rounded profile to the second flatter profile in this area, and then continuing with the flat second cross section from this point up until the end. So if we just click apply now, we'll see that that's created exactly what we're looking for there. So we've got rounded consistently up until this point, and then it transitions from rounded to flat in this area, and then continues flat up until the end of the shape. So that's given us now a pretty realistic looking outline, but of course we do need to just trim that to the shape. of the actual fish. So with that now, I'm going to close out of the 2-rail sweep form, and we're just going to take a look at our component tree here. And we can see the component that we've just created, the basic shape component here in our tree, and it's placed in level 1. So the first thing I'm going to do is just right click on level 1, and I'm going to rename that, and we're going to call that basic shape 2. So we've got a basic shape level, and within that we've got the basic shape component. And now what we can look to do is just take this basic 3D model that we've created and just trim that up using one of the vector outline shapes that we imported. So in the 2D view, we can just click to select that component, and I'm just going to come up to the layers menu, and I'm going to switch back on the outline layer, which contains our outline shapes. And in there we can see the perimeter vector for the trout. So we'll just select that by holding down shift. So we've got the component selected as well as that outline vector. And then in order to trim that component to the outline of this vector, we're going to use this tool here. So under the modeling tools on the 3rd row, second in, we've got clear area of selected component outside selected vectors. And we just left click once to select that. And you can see now it's being applied in the 3D view. So we've got this kind of wavy shape on the bottom now. So we can tell that it's been trimmed to the outline vector shape. And with our basic shape now created, I'm free to now start thinking about the other components that we need to add. So the eyes, the fins and gills, and also the detailing that we need to add on the top. First of all, I think I'm going to start with the eye. So we'll select that vector, and we're going to come back up to the modeling tools, and we're going to use create a shape from vector outlines. So we'll click to go into the form. And within the create shape form, we're going to select our shape profile. So in this case, we're going to be using a curved profile. And the angle of that profile in this case, we're going to set at 90 degrees. So we get a nice sharp mating point between the basic shape and this component. Moving down the form, we're going to set the base height to 0. Our final height, we actually want to limit here. So we'll choose this option, limit to height. And we're going to limit it in this case to 0.05 inches. And that will essentially create a shape with a curved profile of 90 degrees, but once it gets to 0.05 inches in height, it will flatten off. But actually thinking about it, because I want to be creating an eye shape, so we want a rounded dome for the lens of the eye, we'll choose this option to scale to exact height. So that will still scale it to 0.05 inches, but will retain the curved profile. It won't just get to that limit using the curved 90 degree angle and then flatten off. It'll alter the angled edges of the shape so that it fits within that 0.05 shape height. And in the last part of the form again, we're going to choose our combine mode, which in this case will be add, and we'll give that a name. So we'll call that eye, and then we can click apply. And we can then see that represented in both the 2D and the 3D views. So if we just take a closer look at the 3D view now, we'll see that we've got a nice curved profile here, which has been scaled to exactly 0.05 inches, and we've retained that domed surface. So that's exactly what we wanted there. So I'll just click to put that back in Z, and we can start to think about another component. And to do this, instead of coming out of the form completely to select a new vector, we can use this option at the bottom of the form, Start New Component. And that means that we then stay within the form, but we're able to come across and select a new vector to create a shape from. And the second component that I want to have a look at here is the gill. So I've selected that vector in the 2D view, and then we can come back over to the create shape form. So we're going to be using the same curved profile, but this time instead of a 90 degree angle, I'm going to use a very shallow angle of 5 degrees. We're not going to set a base height again, and this time with the final height, instead of scaling it or limiting it to an exact height here, we're actually going to set that at no limit. Because with an angle of only 5 degrees on that curved profile, we shouldn't have too great a shape height anyway. And what we're looking for here is just a nice gentle raise to this profile here on top of the main shape. And then we can also choose the combine mode of this, which again is going to be added on top of the basic shape. And we can name this, so we'll call this gill, and we can click apply. And we can see that a component's been added in by this representation in the 2D view. But if we just take a closer look at the 3D view, you can't see much of a change in this basic shape profile. So we can see in this area here that it has lifted it up slightly, but it's barely visible. So what we need to do is to change the shape of the component here, in particular at the point where the gill meets the body. so that we can give it a bit more of a hard edge. And to do that, we can use the tilt command within the create shapeform. So if I just switch that on, and then if we come up to our 2D view, we can set the 2 points that are going to define the direction of the tilt. So if we click set, you'll see that the cursor then changes in the 2D view, and we're going to place our first point in an area where we want the least shape height. So I'll place that at the front there. The tilt direction will travel to the back, so you can see as you pull this out, we can drag around the line that represents the tilt direction, and we're going to want the most tilt towards the back of the shape, so we'll place our second point at the back there. And you can see now that that's immediately lifted that back edge of the component to a much greater extent than the front. But we're just going to change the tilt angle here, and we'll set that. We can either use the slider to move it in increments, or we can set an exact angle by typing in the box there. And you can see now that we've got a great definition between the gill and the body, but we have still got quite a hard edge there, so we will need to smooth that off later, but that's just lifted that enough so that we can see the separation between the gill and the body. So I'm really happy with the adjustments that we've made there, so I can put the 3D view back into Z, and we can close out of the create shapeform. And what we need to look at doing now is trimming this second component, the gill component, to the rest of the outline shape. So to do that, we're going to left click on the new component, the gill component, so double click on there, and then we're going to shift and also select the main body, the outline shape. And we looked earlier on in the tutorial at trimming a component to a vector outline, but we can also look to trim a component to another component. So with the selection order that we've used here, we've selected the gill component first, so that will be the component that we're trimming, and we selected the basic shape component second, so that will be the component that we're trimming to. So with those selected, we can come back up to the clear area of selected component outside selected vectors and left click, and we can see now that that's trimmed away the front of the gill component, and we've now got a nice continuous outline around the trout. Okay, so the next part of this would be looking at smoothing the transition between the gill and the body. So I'm just going to double click to select just the gill components again. And we're going to come across now to the sculpting command, which is in the top line of the modeling tools. We can see sculpt visible model. And once the form opens, you can see that you're presented with a number of tools, one of which is the ability to change the view. So I'm just going to zoom in on this area just to give us a better view in the 3D view. And we can just go back into the smooth tool again, which is this first icon here. But before we can do any smoothing, we just need to set the diameter of the area that we're smoothing and the strength and smoothness settings. So I'm going to want it roughly 60 on the slider for the diameter, so we can just click and drag that back down, set that around the 60 mark. Strength we can leave at the halfway mark, so at 50, and the smoothness we're going to put that at around 75. And with that now we can start smoothing. So I'll bring my cursor over into the 3D view, and you can see that the area that you're looking to smooth has been highlighted with this blue circle. So that's the diameter that we're going to apply the smoothing to. And in order to apply smoothing to an area, we just need to use the left mouse click. So we can click there, and you can see that it's added some in within the area of the circle. But then we can drag this with the left mouse button held down around the perimeter of the shape. And we can see that it's adding it to the front there. So we'll just trace this round. And you'll see that it's adding much more smoothing into the right-hand side of the shape where we've got a greater shape height. And you'll also notice that we can't see the basic shape component, so it's only trying to refine the smoothing within the boundary of this existing component that we have selected. So to change that, we can deselect this option here to preserve transparency. And you'll see now that as I come back in and apply the smoothing again, that it's bleeding out outside of the boundary of the selected component. And if I let go, you'll see that the boundary of the component has now extended up to the point that we've smoothed up to. So I'll just smooth around the front a bit there. And we may need to blend this out at a later point because it is looking quite fuzzy in that area. So I'm quite pleased with what we've got there, but what we now need to do is just sort of grade this top edge so it kind of feathers into the main body, so that gradually as we're coming round, so we get into this area where we've got more of a gill shape, we can keep the harder lip that we've got at the moment, so it's just this upper right section that needs to be feathered out into the main body. So I'm just going to increase the strength there a little bit. And again, holding down the left mouse button, I'm just going to feather this out a little bit, just in this area, and then stopping at this midpoint where it meets the main bit of the gill, just so there's a smooth transition into the main body in this area. And with that done, I'm happy with what we've done here. So in order to commit this and apply the changes that we've made to this component, in the form we just need to hit keep. And once that's done, we can click OK to exit the form. And then you can see the two components that we're transitioning between in this area together. So you can see the areas that we've feathered out in the 2D view here. And we can see the amount of smoothing that we've applied here in the 3D view. And that as we kind of get down towards this midsection of the main gill here, it then opens up to this more hard edge. Okay, so we don't need to be zoomed in now, so I'll just put the 3D view back into Z. And we just need to look at trimming out the gill component to the outline again now. Because as I was saying, when we were smoothing, the areas that we've smoothed up to have been included now in the perimeter of the component. So I'll just double click to select that. Hold down Shift and double click to pick the main outline or the basic shape component, and then we can come back up to clear area of selected components outside selected vectors. And we can see that's been trimmed away, so if I just double click to deselect there, and we can just have a look at this in its entirety. So we've got the changes that we made to the gill component, and then we've re-trimmed it back to the original outline shape. Okay, so the next part that we're going to look at now is creating the components for the fins. So we'll start by selecting the vector which represents the front fin here. And we're creating a new component from that, so we'll use the Create Shape tool. And we're going to want a rounded profile again, so we'll choose Curve Profile. And the angle will be 30 degrees in this case. This time we are going to use a base height, so we're going to set it at 0.05 inches. And that's just to lift the fin from the background. We're not going to limit the final height, so depending on the width of the vector, we're going to get variable height across that. And we'll leave the combine mode on merge for now, and we'll just come down and we'll call this fin 1 and hit apply. And straight away you'll see that that's been added in, but because of the combine mode here, it's been added on top of the basic outline. So this time we actually want to set this component's combine mode to merge. So we'll come across and we'll select this option here. And you can see now that that's then merging in with the basic shapes component. So I'm happy with how that looks, but I'm not really that happy with how it's transitioning into the base shape at the moment. We need it to continue a little bit further up on top of the basic shape component so it looks like it's on this side of the shape. At the moment it looks like it's on the other side. So to change that, again, we can use the tilt function. So I'll just switch that on and we'll click set so that we can then set the anchor points for the tilt direction. And again, because I want the greatest height increase to be at this side, I'll set the first point where I want the least increase. And we'll put the second point up there. So you can see the change in the 3D view here. So that's looking good. It's gone in the right direction, but that's a little bit too much of a tilt angle there because we can see this vertical edge here, so we can look to decrease that slightly. So just using the slider, we'll just move that down. About there looks great. So we've still got a bit of a lip here, but we can look to smooth that out later, and that's looking great. So I'll just put that back in Z. And I'm happy with that first fin now, so we can start with a new component. So we'll select Start New Component from the Create Shape form. And we'll come across to the next fin along on this underside, so this one. And we'll notice that this is actually a fin from the other side of the fish, so we don't actually need to add any tilting on this one. We can just have this end with a hard border into the basic shape. We'll come back over into the Create Shape form. Again, we're going to be using a curve profile with the same angle. The base height again is going to be 0.05 inches. No limit to the final height with no tilt. Again, the combine mode is going to be set to merge, and we can just give this a name, so we'll call this fin 2 and click apply. And that's been added in both the 2D and the 3D view, but we just zoom in here. We can see that without the tilt, we've got this hard border here, so it definitely looks like it's coming round from the other side. And that's actually looking great as it is, so we don't need to make any edits to that one. So we can start a new component, and we'll pick the vector that represents the larger fin that happens to be on this side this time. And we'll set the exact same parameters again. So just check through the form. We'll leave tilt switched off to begin with, just to see what we get. But we're going to come down and we'll call this fin 3. We'll click apply. And we can see straight away there that we've got the same problem as the first fin, that it's disappearing round the back. So we've got a hard edge here with the basic shape component. So again, to change that, we can go back over to select tilt. We'll go to set and we'll set the direction of the tilt again from bottom to top because we want it lifted at the top edge. And that's just lifted that shape height on the top there. So we can see it's now showing on the top side of this base shape component, but we just twiddle this around in the 3D view. We can see that we've got quite a vertical edge here. So that's going to be a little bit too high on that side. So we need to lower the tilt angle. So we'll just go down in increments using the slider again. Let's go down there. So 5 degrees is looking good, but we've still got this tiny area here. So we can look to remove that. So if I'll probably just go to 4. And that's looking perfect. So we'll apply that. And then we can go back into Z. And moving along now onto what will be fin number 4. We're going to hit start new component. And we're going to select the vector for this back fin here. And we're going to use a slightly lower angle. So go from 30 down to 20. Because I'm imagining this fin to be more in the centre line of the underside of the fish, I'm going to lower down the base height from 0.05 inches to 0.03. No limit again to the final height. And we'll leave tilt deselected for now to see what we get. And we're going to call this fin 4 and apply. And we just have a look at that one again in the 3D view. So we can take a close look at the transition here. And one of the other reasons that we lowered the base height in this case is because we've got a thinner portion of the profile here. So if we had a higher base height, it would have protruded over the top of this basic shape. Once again, we do need this fin to be overlapping slightly with the base. So again, I'm going to apply a tilt and we'll click set. We'll place our anchor point in the direction of the tilt. And at the moment it's set to 4 degrees. So we can see that's way too much there. So we'll just lower that down, just go down to 3. See how that looks. And we just change the view, just have a quick look at that. So we have got a bit of vertical edge protruding there. We might get away with that, but I might just lower it down. Just see what 2.75 looks like. And I think that will give us a much easier time with a bit of smoothing later on. So that'll be taken care of. So that's fin 4 done. So we can click apply. So we've completed the fins on the bottom side of the base shape, so we can now start to look at the top edge. So we'll start with this one on the right hand side. So again, just selecting the vector and we'll come back into the form, curve profile again. We'll keep the angle the same at 20 degrees and the same base height 0.03 because it's still thinner at that base edge. No final height limit, and we're not going to apply a tilt for now, and we can just come down and call this fin 5. Combine mode's already set to merge. We can click apply. And once again, just having a close check in the 3D view, just to see that we're happy with this transition. And to be honest, that looks pretty good there, so I don't really think I need to apply a tilt. So I'll put that back in Z, and we can start a new component. And this time it's going to be the final fin, so this top dorsal fin. It's of a different shape, this fin, so I'm going to lower the angle down to 15 degrees. We'll keep it a curved profile, but we're going to increase the base height back up to 0.05 inches because, as you can see, we've got quite a thick rim there. No limit to the height, and I'm not going to tilt this one. And we'll merge it in, and we'll call this one fin 6. And just looking at that transition, that looks perfect. So it looks like it's on directly on the top of the fish. And with that final fin now completed, we've now created all our basic shape components. So we've got our basic shape underneath, we've got the gill, the eye, and all the fins. And it's really starting to take shape now, but we're just lacking a bit of detail, so it's not looking very realistic at the moment. So the next part of this will be looking to add in some of the detail that we see in our bitmap image here, which should give us a really realistic trout model. But first, we're done with the create shape form, so we can close out of that. And we can see in our component tree here all of the components that we've created. So we've got fin 1 through to 6. We've got the gill, the eye, and the basic shape. But before we go on to apply some of the smaller detail to the trout here, we really should look at applying a global smoothing to it, and maybe some interactive smoothing just to help with the blend from the fins into the main body. And to move forward with this, it may be best at this point to consider the whole of the trout as a single entity. At the moment, it's just a combination of all of these separate components added together. So what we're going to do first, we're going to right click on basic shape, and we're going to go down to insert new level. And then we're going to right click on this new level and rename it Trout, okay? And we'll just click off and we can see that's the active level because that's bold and in dark blue. And what we're going to do is take all of the components that are currently displayed in the 3D view and we're going to turn them into a single component. So to do that, under modeling tools, we've got this option here to create component from visible model. And that will take all of those individual components. And if we left click, that's now placed a copy of the visible model in the new trout layer. So we can see that in there. So I'm just going to switch off the original and we're going to right click and rename this basic trout because at the moment we haven't added in any of our detail. And now we can see that we've got the whole trout selected as a single component. We click off. We can click on any one of what were individual components and it'll be selected as a whole. And we're going to look to apply some gentle smoothing at first. So we'll go back into the modeling tools and this time we're going to use apply smoothing filter to selected components. And once the form's open, you'll be presented with this slider so we can go all the way from minimum smoothing to maximum. So we'll just take that to the maximum just to show you what that looks like. So we're losing a lot of the detail there. So we only want very subtle smoothing here. So I'll probably put that down to around the 30% mark, and that's looking great. It's just taking off some of those edges. I'm very happy with how that's looking now. It's looking a lot more realistic, but we've still got some areas that we could do with some additional smoothing, like the corners of these fins, just to help with the transition into the main body. So I'm going to click OK to accept the smooth components, and we're going to select it again as a single entity, and we're going to go back in now and use the sculpting tool. Before I click into that though, I'm just going to focus in on the areas that we're looking to smooth in the 3D view. Because once I go into the form, I'd have to change the tool in order to change the 3D view over to this one. And we've got our smoothing tool selected. So we just need to set the parameters here. So I'm going to dial the diameter down a little bit around to the 50% mark. Going to lower the strength slightly. And the smoothness will be absolutely fine at the 75. And again, we can see the area of the smoothing that we're going to be applying, represented by this blue circle. And we can just click the left mouse button and I'm simply just going to feather out these areas because we're just helping the transition from the fin into the main body here. Nothing too dramatic, we don't want to take off too much detail. Just taking off the hard edges. Okay, maybe a little bit there. And this corner here. Again, just using the back and forth feathering motion. And after doing that, you can see now that we've got a really nice smooth transition from this basic shape into these individual fins. So to keep that, we can go down to the changes section. We'll click keep and that will commit that and we can click OK to come out of the form. And with that, we're now in a position where we've got our basic trout shape complete. And we're just going to want to think about adding in the detail that we can see in the bitmap image. And we can look to add those on top of these existing shapes. So at the moment, we've got none of the scales or blemishes or the detailing around the gills and eyes. And there are a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this. So we could take a look at grabbing the bitmap image and overlaying it over the top, and then using the sculpting tools, we can manually trace all of that detail. But we could also look at using a really powerful feature within the software which would enable us to take this bitmap image and convert it into a relief model which can then be overlaid over the top of the existing components. So we'll have a look at the first of those two options here. So we'll select the bitmap image and then we'll hold shift and we'll also select the composite model for our trout. And then we can come across the modeling tools again and go back into the sculpting tool. And you'll notice that this time, because we had that bitmap image selected when we went into the form, we can also see it as an overlay in the 3D view. So this option here was already selected, show overlay image, so we can switch that off and back on again. And then we've got a slider underneath which will enable us to change the opacity. So we can increase it or decrease it. So I'll just set that to around the 30% mark, and I'm just going to twiddle the view so we can zoom in on the gill area, so we can just pick up some of that detail there. And to start creating some of these detailed areas, I'm going to first look at the remove material tool. And just going down to the parameters, I'm just going to tone the diameter down slightly because we're working with highly detailed areas. The strength I'm going to set about halfway, and also we'll leave the smoothness at halfway as well. And just coming over into the 3D view now, just like the smoothing tool, you can see the area that we're going to be removing material from, represented by the blue circle. And holding down the left mouse button, we can just start to pick up some of these detail areas. Just tracing in the outlines, just to sculpt all this away. And just pick up these lines here. And I might just sort of increase the strength up quite high here and come in and start picking up some of these speckles. And you can see now, just from this quick demonstration, how much control this gives you over the sculpting of the existing model. But in areas with high detail, you can see how this would be a really time-consuming operation to pick out all these speckles, scales, and the lines on the fins. And if we come across now and just switch off that overlay image, we can see that we've started to add in some of these fine detailed areas. And that's a really powerful tool for making fine adjustments to highly detailed sections of a model. But if you're looking to apply a more overall kind of pattern detail to the whole model, then you can see how this could be slightly time consuming. So we will look at the second method that I mentioned earlier. But before I do that, I'm just going to discard these changes by clicking discard in the changes section. And we can just click yes to that and close out the form. And we're now going to look at the second method of converting this bitmap image into a shallow relief model, which we can then overlay over the top of our whole composite model. Okay, so we already have the bitmap image selected in the 2D view, and we're going to come across to the modeling tools again, and this time we're going to be using create a component from selected or imported bitmap. And you can see that by selecting that, it's already created a component which is based on the grayscale image of this bitmap image that we imported. So you'll see where we've got darker areas at the top will have more depth, and where there's lighter areas it'll be shallower. So just so that we can have a look at this in isolation, I'm just going to switch off the basic Trout model that we created, and I'm just going to zoom in on this component that was created from the bitmap. So based upon the colours that we have in the 2D view, we're getting different depths in the 3D view. But as you can see, we've got a little bit too much detail here. So we've got way too much depth and there's a lot of noise in this. And we can change that by selecting the component that we've just created in the component tree and coming up to our smoothing command. And the form's immediately opened with the slider at maximum smoothing. So you can see here, that smoothed a lot of the detail out. So we're losing a lot of the clarity in the detail that we want to add to our model. So we can just lower that. We'll go for around 50% first, and you can see some of the speckles and the scales coming back into it. So I'm pretty happy with that level of detail. So I'm going to click Bake Current Smoothing to commit that to the component, and then we can close out of the form. And the next slight issue with this is that we've got way too much depth, and it may be a bit too severe to overlay on top of our 3D model. And we can adjust that through the component properties. So once again, I'm going to select the component in the tree, and under modeling tools on the bottom row, you'll see change the properties of the selected components, which will open the component properties form. And we can see in this form the dimensions of our selected components, and the current shape height is 0.144 inches. So we're going to just lower that slightly, so put it at 0.05. And we can see now in the 3D view that that's just created a very shallow relief that we can overlay on the top of the 3D model just to give it that bit of detail that we need, but not being too severe. So I'm happy with that, and I can close out of the component properties form. And now with that created, we've come to the really interesting part of this tutorial. So we've created our shallow relief model, which is effectively going to act as a texture that we can add on top of our existing composite model. But at the moment it's switched off in the component tree. So the exciting part of this is, if we then switch that on underneath, our trout just absolutely comes to life in the 3D view. So we can just take a closer look at that there in the 3D view. And you'll see that this shallow texture pattern that we placed on the top really heavily details the model, and we end up with a realistic looking fish. We do have some noise around the outside that we just need to trim away in these areas, but that's really easy to do. So we've got the relief model that we created from the bitmap selected, and I'm just going to also select, holding down shift, the basic trout. And we'll come back into the tool that we used earlier, clear area of selected component outside selected vectors. And with that selection order, it means that I'm now trimming that texture layer, which I selected first, to the shape of the basic trout, which I selected second. And now that's been trimmed away, we can have a look at that now in full screen and just double click to deselect that. You'll see now that we've got a really wonderful 3D representation of a trout, and that's simply been taken from a 2D image. And all this just highlights the great strengths of Aspire in being able to take a 2D image, create some vectors and some shapes, and then overlay a really shallow relief model to create some fantastic realistic looking models. And with that completed, all that's left to do here now is to save this into our project folder. So we'll go up to File, Save As, and in this case we'll save it simply as trout.crv.